There are voices that entertain. There are voices that inspire. And then, once in a generation, there is a voice that does something rarer still. It carries an entire people through their pain, their joy, their grief, and their glory. Pastor Shirley Caesar has been that voice for over 7 decades. At 87 years old, she remains one of the most extraordinary figures in the history of American gospel music. Not because of the awards stacked beside her name. Not because of the arenas she has filled or the presidents she has performed for. But because of where she started, what she survived, and how she turned every broken piece of her life into something that lifted others. This is the full story. And it begins not on a stage, but in a tiny, overcrowded house in Durham, North Carolina, where a little girl first learned that music was not a gift. It was a lifeline. Shirley Ann Caesar was born on October 13, 1938, the 10th of 13 children. The house on Chiaqua Street in Durham was small in every physical sense. Rooms packed with bodies, walls thin against the winter cold, and a kitchen where meals were stretched so far that cornmeal mush and bologna sandwiches were considered a good night. There was no indoor plumbing until 1945. Eviction notices came so regularly that the family had learned to breathe around the fear of them. Her father, Big Jim Caesar, stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and worked brutal 12-hour shifts at Liggett and Myers Tobacco Company during the Great Depression, sorting tobacco stems through thick dust for less than $10 a week. Her mother, Hallie, worked there too until a factory injury permanently damaged her left foot and took her off the floor in 1939. Between them, 13 children had to be fed, clothed, and held together. It was a weight that would have crushed most families before they even had a chance to begin. But in that house, pressed against all that hardship, there was one thing that poverty could not touch. There was music. Big Jim Caesar was not only a factory laborer. He was also the lead voice of the Just Came From Gospel Quartet, a towering presence whose singing could fill churches and revival tents with a force that people said made the walls tremble. On weekends, he became someone else entirely. He became the sound that hundreds of people drove miles to hear. And from the very beginning, he saw something in his daughter Shirley that he could not stop talking about. Night after night, he told her that her voice would one day feed nations. He believed that with the conviction of a man who had seen God work in impossible places. So when Shirley was just 6 years old, in 1944, he put her on a stage in front of a room full of grown people and let her sing. She stood there, tiny and steady, and sang Jesus Loves Me while tips landed at her feet. The crowd gave because they felt something. Even then, her voice carried a weight that did not match her size. Then in January of 1946, when Shirley was only 7 years and 3 months old, everything collapsed. Big Jim Caesar suffered a brain seizure during rehearsal and died at just 42 years old. What followed was one of the most heartbreaking images in Shirley's memory. Men carrying her father's body out of the house on a door slab, because in Durham, North Carolina in 1946, no ambulance service would come for a black family. The man who had carried the music, the belief, and the weight of 13 children was gone. And the family he left behind had nothing but grief, debt, and each other. The funeral cost $150, a staggering amount for the family, and could only be covered through gospel community connections. Welfare turned them away. Sheriff's notices came. One of Shirley's brothers was hospitalized for malnutrition in 1947. Hallie thinned their grits with water and kept going, because that was all there was left to do. Shirley could have let that pain silence her. Instead, it gave her purpose. She understood, at an age when most children are still learning to read, that her voice was no longer just something beautiful. It was something necessary. By 1948, when she was 10 years old, she stood at Mount Gilead Baptist Church in Durham before a crowd of 300 people and sang Precious Lord. Her hands trembled. Her voice did not. When the offering plate came back, every dollar went directly to her mother. That was not a performance. That was work. That was survival wrapped in song. Pastors began inviting her back. Then they began inviting her to other churches. By 1950, when she was just 12 years old, She was traveling with evangelist Leroy Johnson through the Carolinas and Virginia, riding overnight Greyhound buses, sleeping on seats, opening revival meetings in packed tents for $15 a night. That was more in a week than her father had sometimes earned at the factory. For a child from a house where every coin was counted, that number was enormous. She kept giving it home. By the time she was 13, she had already spent years on stages that would have exhausted grown performers. She was preaching, singing, and holding rooms full of adults with an authority that should not have been possible for someone her age. In late 1951, she recorded I'd Rather Have Jesus for Federal Records in Cincinnati, a session that went out on 78 revolutions per minute discs and traveled through black church networks across the country. It was not a mainstream explosion, but it moved. It was passed from hand to hand, from church to church, from one listening room to another. And people heard that voice and did not forget it. In 1956, showing a practicality that defined her, Shirley enrolled at North Carolina College to study business education. She understood that calling alone could not build a life. But the calling kept pulling. In 1957, during a typing test in class, she heard her name called aloud when no one near her had spoken. It happened again later that evening. She described the words that came to her as clear and direct, a voice telling her she had been called from her mother's womb to preach the gospel. She walked out of that classroom and never looked back in the same way. That same year, she followed the Caravans, already the most powerful female gospel group in America, and boldly auditioned for their lead singer Albertina Walker. She told Walker she knew all the parts. When she sang, Walker had no choice but to say yes. From 1958 to 1966, Shirley Caesar spent 8 years with the Caravans that turned her from a child prodigy into a national force. The group toured constantly, filled churches from coast to coast, and recorded major gospel songs that passed between black communities like shared prayers. Shirley entered as a teenager and became the group's heartbeat. Her voice did not simply blend with the harmonies around her. It broke through them. Promoters began billing events as the Caravans featuring Shirley Caesar, because audiences came specifically to hear her. She missed not one concert during those 8 years. Not one. Through hard roads, late nights, long drives, and multiple services in a single weekend, she showed up and delivered. But by the mid-1960s, churches were asking for her alone, not as part of a group, but as an evangelist in her own right. That tension between group loyalty and solo calling grew until, in 1966, she made the boldest decision of her career. She walked away from the Caravans at the peak of their fame. The gospel world said she was throwing her future away. She had no guaranteed income, no machine waiting to receive her, no safety net. What she had was a suitcase, a Bible, and an unshakable conviction. She formed the Shirley Caesar Singers, rehearsed in church basements and rented halls, and started again from the ground up. Within a few years, the people who had predicted her disappearance were watching her rise instead. By the early 1970s, she had developed what audiences and critics would eventually call sermonic gospel, a performance style that was unlike anything else in the music world. She walked out in white robes and turned the stage into a revival tent. For 30 to 40 minutes before singing a single note, she would preach, tell stories, shift voices, lift the crowd, and then slide into song without breaking the spirit of what she had built. It felt less like a concert and more like being dropped into the center of a black church at its most alive and electric moment. People shouted. They cried. They testified. She made arenas feel like sanctuaries. That gift brought her extraordinary recognition. In 1972, Shirley Caesar won her first Grammy Award for Best Soul Gospel Performance for Put Your Hand in the Hand of the Man from Galilee. It was the beginning of a collection that would eventually total 12 Grammy Awards, spread across decades, with victories in 1980, 1984, 1985, 1992, 1993, 1995, 1996, 1999, and 2000. In 2017, she received the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, one of the most prestigious honors in the music world. Beyond the Grammys, she collected approximately 15 Dove Awards, 14 Stellar Awards, an NAACP Lifetime Achievement Award, and a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2010, one of the very few gospel artists ever to receive that honor. When her name was unveiled on that sidewalk, she did not simply smile for photographs. She preached right there at the ceremony, turning the moment into a worship service on a Hollywood street. In 1975, she reached an audience far beyond the church world with her version of No Charge, a song about a mother's love that climbed to number 40 on the Billboard R&B chart in early 1976 and crossed into pop territory as well. For a gospel artist in that era, that kind of crossover was almost unheard of. It proved that Shirley Caesar's voice could move hearts that had never sat in a pew. In 1983, she married Bishop Harold Ivory Williams, Senior Bishop of Mount Calvary Holy Church of America, and together they co-pastored Mount Calvary Word of Faith Church in Raleigh, which grew to 1,500 members. After Bishop Williams passed on July 4, 2014, she stepped forward as senior pastor. She served on Durham City Council from 1987 to 1991, advocating for housing for the poor and elderly, a choice few gospel artists have ever made, and one that made perfect sense for a woman who grew up knowing exactly what poverty felt like from the inside. In May 1984, at 45 years old and in the middle of a Grammy-winning career, she graduated magna cum laude from Shaw University with a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration, completing the education she had left behind in 1958 to follow her calling. She later studied at Duke Divinity School and received honorary doctorates from Shaw and Southeastern. In 2000, the Gospel Music Association inducted her into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame, not as a farewell gesture, but as a recognition of a living legend who was still recording, still traveling, still standing before thousands. Her most recent studio album, Tear Your Kingdom Down, was released in May 2024. At 87 years old, Shirley Caesar is not a relic to be placed carefully behind glass. She is the living proof of something this world keeps trying to forget, that the hardest beginnings do not determine the size of a life. A 7-year-old girl who watched her father carried out on a door slab, who sang to feed her family, who rode overnight buses through Jim Crow America with $15 in her pocket, went on to win 12 Grammys, fill arenas on 6 continents, preach to presidents, and pour her earnings back into the communities that raised her. She turned grief into gospel, poverty into purpose, and pain into praise that outlasted every person who ever doubted her. That is not a career. That is a testimony. And after more than 80 years of living it, Pastor Shirley Caesar is still here to tell it.